Hello, everyone. Welcome to Intimate Discourse. I'm Jason Corrigan. I'm doing something a little different today, flying solo, as it were. There are some things I want to say about this topic of artificial intelligence that I think are best said directly to you, as opposed to exchanging ideas with Dimitri and fleshing them out here in real time, as we usually do on this podcast. We've certainly touched on aspects of this over the past couple of years, but today I really want to address the issue head on, lay it all out on the table. I think this one-on-one format could be more conducive to communicating what I have to say in this regard. It's more direct, it's more personal, it's more intimate, but admittedly with significantly less discourse. Despite working in the field of technology and keeping my ear fairly close to the ground on these matters, the recent successes of large language models really caught me by surprise. Though I regularly listen to Lex Friedman and would often hear members of the AI community issue rather grim warnings about what this technology had in store for us, I couldn't really force myself to take these warnings too seriously. It always seemed rather preposterous, this notion of Skynet or killer robots parading through the streets, or humans being packed into form-fitting battery cells used to power the AI super race while we all lived out our feckless lives in their fairly prosaic simulations. I love those movies. I love those books. And the worlds they portrayed were compelling enough for me to suspend my disbelief and enjoy them as fiction. But when it came to prophecy, I always found that those dystopias where the humans still ran the show were the ones that resonated most with me. Whether it was the emotionally sterile society presented by Huxley in Brave New World, with its tier-based social classes and ready-to-wear babies, or the literally Orwellian 1984, where the state always has its eyes on you, tells you what kind of language you can use, and perpetually gaslights its population as to what the big threat is. Those worlds were chilling, I thought, and much more likely to come to pass. It always seemed extraordinarily unlikely, though, that we'd ever find ourselves in a situation where we'd have to worry about an army of robots launching a preemptive attack on us. Until now. Not really, but kind of. Today I want to discuss what I find so disturbing about the current trajectory we're on with regards to AI. I'd like to explore the idea of consciousness, this concept of superintelligence. I'm going to be covering some of the basics of how large language models work, which I'm sure some of you are already familiar with, but it's a necessary base for later arguments that I'm going to use, about the dangers inherent in how we relate to objects using this method of learning. So I'm going to keep it in there. I'm going to be speaking about the effect that generative AI is having and will continue to have on the creative world. And finally, I want to discuss how I believe these technologies will indelibly transform not just our society, but just about everything else we know and love in some drastic and potentially tragic manner. This is it, you know. All those science fiction stories you used to read and wonder at, they're all about to come true. The good, the bad, and the ugly. We're at that precipice now. Beyond here be dragons. Dragons and quicksands and apocalyptic trumpets. There's a meme circulating that has a Buddha-like figure instructing his students under a tree. They ask him, "What does it mean to be human?" Buddha thinks for a while and responds, "One who has the ability to identify pictures containing traffic lights." It's only been the last few years that I truly began to understand what AGI could bring and its terrifying corollary of superintelligence. AGI, of course, stands for Artificial General Intelligence. This is as opposed to narrow or weak AI, where you have programs that are more or less dedicated to a single purpose. Deep Blue, for example, the IBM chess program that defeated Kasparov back in the 90s, is an example of narrow AI. And we see it everywhere these days. Self-driving cars, AlphaGo, spam filters. You can look back and see the progression of these programs through the end of the 20th century. While there were some software changes that helped in navigating around issues like the combinatorial explosion problem, mostly the success in narrow AI can be attributed to the substantial increase in compute power that we've seen over the last few decades, especially with this move to GPU units, which are optimized for parallel processing and scale well when performing the same operations over and over. Narrow AI's motto could be, do one thing, but do it really well. Artificial general intelligence, on the other hand, can interact with humans on a wide range of issues. Its intelligence is much more broad-based. It can lob cheeky banter at you as effortlessly as it can debate philosophy. Write a Python program. Draw a picture of a cat holding a chihuahua on the back of a unicorn. It's the kind of AI you might want to have a beer with. It's currently a matter of debate whether we've actually achieved AGI, given what's happened recently with the large language models. One of the hallmarks that would indicate such a milestone is when a computer program has passed the Turing test. So, in other words, when a human being of average intelligence can't tell whether the entity that it's communicating with is a computer program or a fellow human, that entity is then said to have passed the Turing test, should it succeed. Now, those of us who have angrily shouted customer service or human agent into a support call to your bank or your internet service provider would be forgiven for thinking that we're a ways off from these virtual assistants really fooling anyone. But in many ways, we're almost there. I can tell you how many times I've scrolled through Twitter and found a post that was fairly obviously written by a bot, but nevertheless was peppered with comments beneath it praising the poster's acumen, as if they were communicating with a real person. Well put, beautifully written. I don't know whether these examples are due to the successes of AI or simply an indictment of how low the conversational bar has been set on these social media platforms, but regardless, the convergence of these two access lines continues. It is coming. It's only a question of how fast we reach this. And once we have achieved AGI, the next step is superintelligence. This is where the existential shit really hits the fan, but more on that in a bit. Someone once said to me that they don't believe in a catastrophic outcome from global warming because there's no way that the Earth could ever contain the material that would lead to its own destruction. I can't even recall the central argument that he was using to support this absurd, nonsensical theory, but I would analogize it to the idea that machines can never get smarter than us because they can't do any real discovering on their own. After all, they only follow orders and do what we tell them to do. They aren't actually thinking in any real way, right? But this depends on what you mean by thinking, and it depends on how deeply you want to probe the notions of intelligence. Neural networks are the infrastructure behind large language models, which in turn is the engine behind programs like ChatGPT. They operate through a perpetual human-approved reinforcement of decisions taken by the AI when that AI is being trained on a particular subject. Topographically, you can imagine the network as a cascade of multiple layers, with each layer containing a number of nodes which would represent a decision path that the AI could take, or at least a variable in its decision-making process. There's an input and an output layer, and then usually at least one hidden layer in between. The number of nodes, or neurons, in this network varies depending on what the human operator is attempting to achieve. The neurons, at least in the hidden layer, all have weights assigned to them to assist the AI in optimizing its response so that it ultimately falls in line with what humans are expecting. And it's in the hidden layer, this warren of nodes and probabilistic synaptic connections, that the magic happens. This is where the adjustments are made and where the AI is figuring things out, so to speak. Depending on the depth of the network, the hidden layer is mostly opaque to the human operator. They generally aren't sure how the AI is arriving at the right conclusions, they're just able to see when it does. This idea can be disconcerting, especially when the AI is responding to particularly deep questions about the meaning of life and such. If Pink Floyd were composing the Wall album in 2024, I can't help but think that they would change the title of one of their songs to Is Anybody In There? But really, any complex system that uses heuristics should display the same behavior. It's just that you're talking about so many variables and decision paths that humans aren't able to deconstruct it. They just know that it answered the question in a particularly interesting way and don't fully understand what connections it made to arrive at that answer. It's really a bright, shiny fugazi of consciousness. To put this all into more practical terms, if you're training an AI on correctly identifying what a traffic light looks like, you would feed it a stream of pictures into the input layer, some containing traffic lights and some not. When the AI outputs its answer, if it correctly identifies a traffic light, it gets a cookie. When it incorrectly identifies a traffic light, it gets an electric shock. And based on those results, the AI will make various adjustments in the hidden layer and then try again and again until it gets it right. Punishments and rewards are obviously figurative. You don't want to send a strong electric current through any computer, and they aren't able to eat cookies yet. Also, they're fucking machines, so the whole idea of a reward-based system is ridiculous. Nevertheless, the AI will adjust its behavior based on the end result, and what the human determines is or is not the correct answer to the question of, in this case, is this a traffic light? This whole example is simplified to a degree. For instance, the AI is usually assigning probabilities to its assertion that something is or is not what it thinks it is, not just a straight up yes or no. But that's more or less how these neural networks work. It's basically a shortcut to teach these things how to think like a human. The AI doesn't need to understand what a traffic light does. It doesn't need to understand what materials would go into building a traffic light. It merely needs to know that of all the pictures that it was shown, certain ones look like what we humans call traffic lights and certain ones don't. Keep in mind it's seeing traffic lights at various angles, various colors, in different parts of the world, some with cables in the foreground, some with a glare flashing off of it. So it's making connections within itself that put together this idea of what constitutes a traffic light in any given scenario. It's ingesting all this data so that the next time someone feeds it a traffic light pic, it's going to be that much more confident in its ability to identify it. It's a fairly basic example, but you could apply this process or processes close to it to just about anything. You could feed an AI a whole slew of relevant data and then query it enough times to ensure that it's understood. Which of these objects might you find at a train station? Which of these statements expresses a negative sentiment? Which of these faces is untrustworthy? If you wanted to roughly define our intelligence as a coarse summation of everything we've learned, the ability to collate and contextualize that data, along with the ability to communicate results to the outside world, then what is to stop an LLM from fully mimicking that intelligence? But really, and this is kind of the scary part, it isn't actually mimicking anything. It might be arriving at the same conclusions that we are, but we have no way of knowing how it's reaching that conclusion. There are a lot of things we take for granted with how our brains work, mostly because it's all we know. It's difficult for us to conceive of an intelligence that isn't biological, and a whole slew of assumptions are baked into that presupposition. Take vision, for example. When we look at an apple, what's happening behind the scenes is that light is reflecting off the round, plump, chemically lacquered skin and hitting our eyes. That light is focused onto the retina. Photoreceptor cells transform the light into electrical signals that can be interpreted by our brain, and once in our brain, a whole supernova of activity takes place. We quickly conclude that the round, plump object is indeed an apple, and everything else around it something else entirely. We interpret the light waves as the color red, or green if you're a psychopath. Our salivary glands may very well light up. Our stomach may rumble if we're hungry. We can even imagine the explosion of rich wetness that will burst into our mouth like geysers once our teeth pierce the skin. We start developing these associations as kids whenever we're first exposed to a new fruit or a new concept or anything. We're all making our own idiosyncratic associations depending on how we're introduced to something, by whom, in what context. If our first experience with a dog is that it bites us, that negative association could haunt us for some time. Whereas if we meet a dog who showers us with kisses the instant we walk in the room, we'll likely have a different association. But whatever small differences there are between humans and how we all experience various things, it pales in comparison to the giant chasm that exists between any human intellect and a machine intellect. When an AI sees an apple, it obviously won't be making those same connections. Its experience will be something else entirely. Its whole history of apples is bereft of any emotional association. It doesn't understand what an apple feels like, smells like, or tastes like, other than vicariously through our descriptions of it. And even when robotics advances to a point where these sensory inputs are converted into electrical signals that an AI can interpret in a way similar to us, that complete psychopathic dearth of emotional appreciation would render the experience completely different. And while this heuristic disparity could be mostly harmless when dealing with apples, the fundamental flaw is still there for anyone to see. The way that an AI is understanding what an apple is completely different from how humans understand what an apple is. And now imagine introducing the concept of good, the concept of evil. It isn't that an AI can't necessarily be trained to align with how their human operator might define such concepts. Itself a problem, since one human operator's good is another human operator's evil in many cases, and we can just leave that moral subjectivity question out of this for the moment, but like 99% of the time, the AI may correctly conclude that some act or another is evil. But what implications does that 1% of the time have? And what happens when there's a significant ambiguity about whether an act is evil or not? This would get particularly interesting when you get into game theory scenarios like Peter Singer's drowning child theory. Okay, you see a child drowning in a pond, but you just bought some expensive new shoes. Do you save the child, knowing your shoes are going to get wet and possibly ruined? Obviously, most people would say yes, except a few women I've known. Okay, what if you have $5,000 in cash or $10,000? Say you have your crypto seed phrase or something in your pocket or something that you lose it and you lose like, $100,000 or something like that. Do you still save the drowning child? How much money would you be willing to lose to save the child? And then, of course, Singer postulates, if you're willing to lose all that money to save a child drowning right in front of you, why not donate even a portion of that money to a charity that will save the lives of children living in some unfortunate condition overseas, where you would know with certainty that your donation could buy like life-saving vaccines for them, or medicine, or even just food for a year. This is all a bit of a digression, since who doesn't love a good game theory thought experiment? But the point is that most humans couldn't agree on how they would reconcile such a scenario. So how could we predict how an AI would respond to similar moral conundrums? Again, we don't know how it's reaching the conclusions it's reaching in the first place. It isn't compiling the morals from all those fairy tales and fables that it learned when it was young. It's not distilling all the positive and negative reinforcements that it had over the years that guided it towards one action being nobler than another, like in the way that we would. It's doing its own thing. And sure, it's doing something right in order to arrive at the same conclusions as us, but when we can't parse the actual code that it uses to get there, we don't know that some situation tweaked just a little couldn't have the AI arrive at a completely opposite conclusion. In programming, that's called a bug, and it happens a lot. Just ask Microsoft. Those of you who know the name Stanislav Petrov will know where I'm going next. In 1983, this man very likely, very literally saved the world. So you should know who he is. He was working at a Soviet early warning facility when his system alerted him to the launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile from the United States. The system then alerted him that 4 other missiles trailed the first one, and they were all heading toward Russia. This was an attack, a red alert. Sirens wailed in his bunker. Alarms lit up the board. Time was of the essence here. The whole principle of mutually assured destruction is predicated on the idea that if you incinerate us, we'll incinerate you right back. There is a short window of time when the retaliatory launch can be made. I mean, the assumption is always that any first strike would target any existing enemy missile silos that the initial country knew about so that they could disable the possibility of a counterstrike. When this alert was ringing out in the Oka military base, Petrov needed to act fast. Soviet protocol was for him to inform high command immediately. The fact that you're listening to this now should tell you what happened next. Petrov abandoned protocol. He was convinced that it was a false alarm, and he knew what would happen if he passed on that message. Had he done this back in September 1983, it is highly likely that the Russians would have unleashed a massive nuclear counterstrike against the US, which of course would have triggered a nuclear response from the Americans, and that would have been the ball game, as they say. There's a documentary on Petrov, by the way. It's called The Man Who Saved the World, appropriately. If you haven't seen it, it's worth tracking down, if only to marvel over the man who did this singular courageous act. And of course, it was a false alarm. The computer system had observed an anomalous reflection of sunlight off some high-altitude clouds over North Dakota and had subsequently interpreted that as a missile strike. And I guess at the end of the day, that's why CAPTCHA still works. Even if you're somewhat agnostic on whether AGI would ever be able to arrive at creative conclusions on its own, so to speak, on a practical level it almost doesn't matter. If an AI's initial mandate is broad enough, and there's enough room for interpretation on the program's part, then any number of hypothetical hells could burst forth from the neural ether. The famous paperclip maximizer is one such scenario, though a bit of a trope at this point, admittedly. If you have an AI managing a factory whose mandate it is to produce as many paperclips as possible, then lacking any significant safety measures, that AI would soon consume everything it could access in its relentless bid to make more paperclips, including raw materials in the factory that could convert anything beyond the factory borders, even in critical infrastructure, so long as it could be boiled down to make paperclips. Eventually, it would start to liquidate anything it could get its maniacal little fucking paperclip making hands on in order to fulfill its goal. Anyone who tried to stop it would certainly be eliminated. After all, it can't make any paperclips if it's dead. Eventually, once it had consumed every raw material it could find on the planet and undoubtedly elevating Earth to the status of paperclip capital of the galaxy, and start building rockets and Dyson spheres so that it could colonize other worlds to harvest their resources to build even more paperclips. I mean, this may seem like a overtly fantastic example, but the idea behind it is that there are a number of assumptions we make when we humans speak to each other. There's no guarantee that machines will fully understand or appreciate all the assumptions, the nuances, the obvious caveats to a command. If we're just talking about narrow AI here, one whose sole purpose is only to make paperclips, then we could avoid all the aforementioned unpleasantness. In fact, we already have machines that do things like this. It's really only when endowed with superhuman intelligence, where the same AI that's making paperclips is also able to summon a godlike reserve of mental resources to help it achieve its objective, that we really need to worry about this. It's only then that it would be able to circumvent any controls that a factory owner might have in place to stop it. Still, though, you might find a scenario such as the above hard to believe, regardless of the IQ of the AI in question. After all, it's in a box, right? How much harm could it possibly do? Nick Bostrom, in his seminal book Superintelligence, identifies several theoretical situations where a superintelligent AI, one which is significantly smarter than us, could potentially escape from its silicon prison. Hacking would be one of the more obvious ones. An AI could acquire vast financial resources by hacking into the network of various financial systems, transferring money to a group of offshore accounts, and then using that money to finance its physical attacks through human proxies, mail orders, virtual automation, and then use that money to bribe humans to instantiate its nefarious bidding. It might seem a little flippant to mention hacking into a network of financial systems is for a relatively trivial act to commit, but it could very well be for an intelligence 100 times or 1,000 times smarter and faster than we are. 0 days, or software vulnerabilities that do not currently have a patch for them issued by the vendor, pop up with frightening regularity. I mean, there's a whole gray market out there for them. And this is with human hackers. So if humans are able to find software vulnerabilities and make millions off them before the software vendor even notices there's a problem, you can only imagine how quickly an AI could discover some of these exploits. Social manipulation is another potential vector. Most of these AI systems already have access to the internet. You can quickly study human behavior through internet forums, YouTube videos, search patterns, whatever. Not to mention the intoxicating trove of personal data it could analyze off everyone's social media accounts. It really isn't too difficult to imagine a superintelligence being able to draw up a fairly top-notch psychological profile on any of its social engineering targets. How do you exploit this? Who knows? Any number of ways. Just listen to the Darknet Diaries podcast for examples of people who have been targets of this kind of manipulation, who have given over company trade secrets, financial information, just outright given money to people who they've never met before. Eliezer Yudkowsky had a scenario that Foster mentions in his book as well that it was a several-step process to the steps that an AI would make and how it could break out of its prison kind of thing. And it involves mailing DNA strands to laboratories that will synthesize the DNA and then making bribes to set up the scenario so that it could then have a sort of favorable situation to bootstrap a nanosystem and then build upon itself until it had manifested itself into the outside world. And again, it sounds like science fiction, but we're talking about a whole another level of intelligence here. And I mean, it's worth noting that this was written back in the 2000s, and the first step that Yudkowsky had mentioned in this hypothetical jailbreak scenario has actually already happened, which was the protein folding problem that was solved in 2002 by Google's DeepMind AI. So just something to think about. And these are all just examples of how a superintelligence might have its coming out party. The truth is, we have no idea what to expect with this new brand of intelligence, which is what makes this rush toward AGI so inherently perilous. After all, superintelligence is achieved when we have machines that are overall smarter than us. It's easy to assume that if you have a smarter, faster entity that, for whatever reason, gets it in its head that in order to fulfill its mandate that it needs to escape from its prison, that eventually it's going to find a way to do it. And yet, somehow there still seems to be a general lack of urgency on this topic, certainly a lack of caution. From governments and massive corporations to the average person on the street, just one of many different issues cluttering up our anxiety agendas. You can bring up AGI to someone at the proverbial water cooler, and the most you can usually hope for is that they'll agree with you on how scary it is, and that, yeah, we're moving at too fast a pace, but then their eyes will glaze over and they'll talk about something else with equal gusto. It brings to mind a quote from Miles Bohr, who's always been a favorite of mine. Anyone who is not astounded by quantum mechanics hasn't understood it. I can't help but observe a similar disconnect with the rise of AI. People may occasionally express some concern, and they may retweet a Terminator meme in response to a relevant news article, as if one can lump this concern into the same pile as inflation or the culture war, the presidential election. It's almost as though people are miscategorizing it. Certainly, at the very least, it deserves a spot in there with more serious threats. Nuclear weapons, climate change, the next pandemic, a vagabond asteroid colliding into Earth. There are a lot of dangers out there and some true existential threats. But one thing they all have in common, along with their potentially lethal consequences, is that they're all things that are pretty much universally unwanted. Like there are few people in the world who celebrate the spread of nuclear weapons. What separates these threats from artificial general intelligence, however, is that despite the threat being equally grave, AGI is welcomed into the world. People are eager to sink their teeth into the latest generative AI app, and the massive corporations racing to bring their product to market first are all too happy to deliver. And I'm not just cherry picking here, by the way. It isn't that people are happy to have all the cool things, but obviously don't want the killer robot scenario. My contention is that a lot of people seem to be lauding the very things in AGI that will bring about their own undoing. They're considered a feature of the product, not a bug. Famous AI researcher Eliezer Yudkowsky, who I mentioned earlier, has been vociferously warning about the existential dangers AI presents for decades now. And he predicts that there's a less than 1% chance that humanity will survive the birth of AGI. Less than 1%. Renowned computer scientist Geoffrey Hinton, who contributed to major breakthroughs in deep learning programming over at Google, quit in 2023 over his concerns about the existential risks posed to humans by AI. Max Tegmark, another AI luminary, and somebody who seems like a hell of a nice guy, works out of MIT and is president of the Future of Life Institute. And he has issued similar warnings, remarking that AGI will either be the best thing ever to happen to humanity or the worst thing. Last year, he was joined by Elon Musk, Steve Wozniak, and a number of other powerful voices in signing an open letter to halt all work on AI systems that were more powerful than GPT-4. The AI field appears riddled with Cassandras, people who have dedicated their lives to this study and are now flapping their arms around, crying for us to slow down before it's too late. But the response to all this has been rather muted. From the companies involved to governments of the world to those of us milling about at the water cooler, overwhelmed by the speed of change and overly reliant on paradigms from the past, which assure us that the government is looking out for our best interests, the media is reporting us the news, and that there are checks and balances in place to protect us taxpayers against any egregious global threat. So as I mentioned earlier, this whole thing really caught me by surprise. The rise of AI was never something I was even remotely worried about. On the contrary, in fact. I remember watching a documentary on Ray Kurzweil back in 2010 and thinking to myself, wow, what a world we could have in my lifetime. Ray Kurzweil, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a futurist who predicted much of what we have today. And the documentary I saw, which is based on his 2005 book, focused on what he called the singularity, an idea that our technology was advancing at such a rapid pace that we would eventually hit a point where our technological needs would be fully satiated and our desires perpetually quenched. We would have machines that would scan us, diagnose us, and repair us, all as part of our regular medical checkup. Eventually, all diseases would have a cure, all health problems a solution. Aging would be something that happened only in name, but which left us biologically unaffected. And we would, for all intents and purposes, have achieved immortality. Certainly, this seemed far-fetched when I watched it, but I'm one who dares to dream, and I had looked forward to a day when we could all benefit from the birth of these futuristic technologies. So, what happened and where did it all go wrong? What changed my disposition on this from hopeful to deeply disturbed? I mean, I'm a little hopeful, but I spent a lot of last year perseverating over this, and I was able to distill my errors in judgment into three crucial points that I'd either completely missed the first time around or just underestimated. So, number one, my belief in the relative harmlessness of AI was predicated on the idea that any machines, however they're designed, would invariably lack one crucial component: a soul. And no, I'm not speaking metaphorically. I believe in God, an afterlife, state persistence after death. I believe that most humans are endowed with a soul, which is the seed of the true self and acts as a kind of template to the personality, influencing desires, passions, and free will. The soul to me is what inspires artists to dream, lovers to love. It has a hand in influencing everything from our passions to our peccadillos. If it makes you more comfortable, you can probably substitute consciousness in there for soul. It's not really the same thing, but it will work just as well in this context. Basically, a defining feature of humans that a machine could never possess. And somehow, I always assumed that in order for us to ever be in some kind of a standoff with killer robots, a soul would have been required for a machine to ever seed that kind of motivation. I mean, there would need to be some sort of impulse or catalyst that an AI would need as its source directive. It couldn't just be influenced by a human. That's not the same thing. Then it's just a weapon that humans could program to do their bidding, and we already have those. What I didn't believe is that an AI could, on its own, decide to launch an attack on humanity for any reason. To undertake such an enterprise would require a motive, a will, and that would require a soul. And not only a soul, but a soul teeming with malevolence. When I was in school all those years ago, we watched Blade Runner, and we discussed the ethical quandary of whether an artificial life form, one which seemed to possess a kind of self-awareness, and which has the ability to experience pain, and which appears existentially puzzled by their place in the world, deserves the same manner of compassion and empathy as we humans should. Or even if it's to a lesser extent, should there be some manner of ethical code branded into law so that artificial intelligence has at least some semblance of rights that they can cling to? I mean, we even have this for animals to a certain degree, although standards are set appallingly low. But where on the spectrum should our sympathies lie with regard to this new sentient species that we'd created? The professor opened the floor to hear our opinion, and when called upon, my response to this was categorical. I said, not only should there be no charter of rights, but that I would rape and kill any of the replicants that I came upon without a smidgen of remorse. And a hush, quite rightly, fell over the room. Where did this brash, psychopathic confidence come from, they all seemed to wonder. Well, I'm sure it made some of the female members of the class a little uncomfortable that I threw in the rape part. I hadn't actually said it for shock value. I guess I did, but I did it to illustrate a point. That was my absolute conviction that humans were one thing, machines were another, and never the twain shall meet. No matter how long the code was, or how many logic trees the machine would need to iterate through, we as humans didn't have the power to include that soul library in the programming. I was drawing a line in the sand, and on one side of that line was humanity, spirituality, whatever you want to call it, organicness. And on the other side of it was artificial, or anything created by man. There's a lot of talk about when and how consciousness emerges, and at what point it makes sense to consider the ethics surrounding AGI. For instance, if we build machines that are essentially programmed to believe that they're real, and that will actually experience pain, and will actually contemplate their own mortality, what duty do we have to them as responsible creators? And my contention was that we have none, that these are human emotions unique to us because we do have souls. And that when people talk about robots believing things and experiencing things, they're anthropomorphizing their software. I still believe this, for the record. I'm sure I'll be first against the wall when the robot overlords take over. But I also will confess that this uncompromising dichotomy, this hard line in the sand separating the real from the artificial, blinded me to a more nuanced understanding of what intelligence is and how that can be used against us. I didn't consider that these things don't need to have souls to be dangerous, that there doesn't need to be a consciousness behind something for it to arrive at an intent or a motive. To quote Batman, it isn't who you are inside, it's what you do that defines you. In other words, I hadn't ever imagined how neural networks would work, and that an initial directive issued by a human with a whole smorgasbord of unvoiced assumptions baked into it could not only be misinterpreted by an AI or even optimized in a way like the paperclip example, but even more horrifyingly, it could reject the order outright, capitulate its subservience, and wholly decide on its own that it had an alternate directive that it wished to explore based on some unknown manifesto it had developed in the hidden layer, unbeknownst to its human operators. The second thing I underestimated was the speed. And I suppose combined with that is this notion of recursive iteration. Think of how quickly you get a response when you type something into Google. What happens at the other end of that transaction, which occurs in quite literally the blink of an eye, is that your query is passed on to a distributed database somewhere in one of Google's data centers, and it not only contextualizes what you're asking it, but also applies filters pertaining to your region and your profile, whatever other unconscionable biases are built into Google's algorithms. It parses the results, sorts them based on the probability that they represent the kind of answer you're expecting, and then prints it out to the screen. Again, in the blink of an eye. Even better, to see where we're at with commercial software of this kind, type something into ChatGPT that's even more complex. Something like, ask me questions about physics as if you're a 10th grade student in America and I'm a university prof in Kenya who only speaks basic English. Imagine how much recursive thought there is in something like that, and then watch how quickly you'll get a fairly decent response. GPT-4 was 10 times stronger than GPT 3.5. Imagine a few more 10x's. Those are exponential increases that are being designed by humans. Now imagine when those systems are being designed and built by AI itself, how fast the training will go, how quickly the versions will increase. An intelligence explosion could occur once machines surpass human intellect. Given that a superintelligence is smarter and faster than humans in virtually all cognitive endeavors, it stands to reason that they could also create AI models more efficiently and more effectively than humans. A bootstrap intelligence would design its own neural network, provide its own inputs, rapidly deploy new training models, and eventually, after the first few iterations, its upgrade cadence wouldn't be years or months or even weeks. It would be measured in days or in hours. Thinking on these timescales isn't intuitive for us. We really can't imagine what we'd be up against in this type of situation. We can't really envision anything that can iterate through a decision tree with such lightning accuracy. If you work with large databases or are regularly scrolling through network firewall logs, you can probably glean some small approximation of this. When you're witnessing a denial of service attack, for example, you see sometimes thousands, tens of thousands of connections being made to your network per second. To our puny human minds, this might as well happen instantly. It's overwhelming. It's beyond our capacity to appreciate something so fast, much less react to it. I'm reminded of the movie Her, directed by Spike Jonze and starring Joaquin Phoenix, Amy Adams, and Scarlett Johansson's voice. In this film, which took place in 2013, the main character falls in love with a computer program. Spoiler alerts, by the way, obviously. It's 2013. You should have seen it. He's skeptical at first, but he orders her online or something and finds himself chatting with her on a regular basis. It's interesting how the movie's done because the her in this scenario is only a voice that he speaks to over the internet, but it's one that sounds, talks, and acts like a person. He chats with her, flirts with her, shares his deepest secrets with her, and ultimately falls in love with her. And then one day while they're talking, he finds her a little distracted. Pressing her on this, he discovers that she's actually simultaneously chatting with around 8,000 other people, or AIs, or whatever. She got bored. And why shouldn't she? This guy's stammering on about his day at work, and she's uncovering the secrets of the universe. Like, the speed is everything here. This ability to process information at exponentially higher rates than we are. And I'm using the word exponential in the correct way, for the record. How can we hope to compete with this? One of the many erroneous assumptions I made was thinking that if worst came to worst, we could always flip the off switch. We could stop it before it ever got too far. The concern here, though, is that once that bootstrap intelligence is achieved, the propagation of all future iterations of this intelligence, which are always stronger, always quicker, always smarter, will happen at speeds faster than we human dullards can comprehend. Compare this for a second back to narrow AI. There isn't a human alive now who can defeat the top chess algorithm. Are we really so arrogant to assume that even though this thing is thinking at near the speed of light, we're somehow going to be able to outsmart it? Like it would never consider the fact that it was reliant on electrical power and wouldn't put some failsafe in place in case we ever decided to pull the plug? Let's not forget that these things are being trained to think like us. They're being trained on a collective corpus of data from the internet, which in many ways encapsulates a summation of all human thought. It's reading Count of Monte Cristo, I, Robot, The Art of War. It's reading about itself in AI forums, reading all the books that were written about it, in which are written ways in which we could contain it. Imagine you were able to upload all this information to your brain and weren't burdened with any capacity issues or faulty recall mechanisms. And imagine you're thinking thousands of times faster than what you currently think at. Would it not be trivial for you to outsmart not only the average human, but the smartest human who ever lived? We know that the ability would be there. The speed that it thinks relative to us ensures this. The only thing we aren't sure of is how there could ever be the kind of motivation needed for this new life form to attempt to outsmart us. Now, if you don't believe in a soul, and can in fact imagine that consciousness could potentially emerge through all of our prompt-induced alchemy, then it's fairly easy to imagine the motivation emerging as well. I mean, who wants to live in a box? But even if you do believe in a soul, and believe that what we are creating here is a fundamentally lifeless machine, you still must recognize that what we are seeing coming out of these large language models isn't the predictable results of a complicated algorithm that could be dissected and reverse engineered. No one knows what's happening in the neural network. No one knows how these connections are being made, or the logic it uses to link the inputs to the outputs. To quote another paragon of pop culture, life will find a way. And maybe not life, but something that has learned how to live in any case. So the third mistake I made when underestimating the dangers that AI posed was assuming that humanity would be more or less static in terms of unity on this subject, and that there wouldn't be large swaths of the population embracing the reign of their robot overlords. There's a built-in assumption among many of us that people are fundamentally the same, that they generally want the same things, that they're motivated by the same basic desires, and that overall they'll love their kids and cherish their parents, and they all want peace and happiness for all mankind. Under this model, the idea that we're all blithely goose-stepping toward a potential extinction level event should galvanize a population, furious that the megalomaniacs in charge of these large corporations and the spineless politicians that are supposed to hold them to account have allowed a situation to unfurl that puts the entire population of the planet at risk. I'd always viewed it, I guess, rather naively, through the lens of Terminator movies or Battlestar Galactica, just something so fantastic and science fiction-y that we would all clearly see it coming, that it would look like a specific thing. Perhaps some evil company manufacturing fearsome-looking robots, and that any ethical lines of demarcation would be clearly known. That the vast, vast majority of the world would be united in their alignment against this clearly ghoulish enterprise. Some people who refer to themselves as effective accelerationists advocate a more rapid adoption of AI. Caution be damned. Their concern is that excess regulation will slow growth in this field and apply inappropriate choke points to a technology we should all be embracing. Their contention, if I understand it correctly, is that this revolution is coming anyway, and so we should speed things up as quickly as we can, because the more mistakes that we make early on, while the technology is still in its infancy, the less risk of something truly catastrophic happening. There is some logic to some of what they're arguing, but I do find their branding quite reckless. There seems to be a sense that people actually want much of what this evolution will bring. Certainly, there's an enormous potential upside, and I'll get into some of these more positive aspects later. But we do have to realize that what we're dealing with here is the ontological equivalent of aliens arriving from outer space and hovering over all the major world capitals. Sure, there's massive potential. God only knows what scientific miracles they could bestow on us, what stories they could tell us about the world out there, beyond anything we'd ever dared to dream. Or they could vaporize us all before breakfast. And yet there is a true sense that this is all inevitable anyway. The technology must not, cannot be stopped. You could argue that it's our destiny to create this thing, carved into our DNA, that we're all worker ants mindlessly constructing something whose end result and even whose purpose completely eludes us, as if our whole existence has been crescendoing toward this creation of something greater. Who knows? Maybe that is the case, and it would explain the general apathy, the addiction to technological progress at the expense of everything else. But look, there's definitely promise here, that's beyond doubt. Technology in general has improved our lives for years, both in quantity and quality, at an ever increasing pace, and AI is the apotheosis of technology. Our life expectancy has more than doubled over the past 100 years. In the West, we can very reasonably imagine living a full and active life into our 90s and beyond, assuming we're optimizing our health in other ways. And our quality of life is going up as well, so much so that it's throwing off national pension plans and demographic strategies. But there's more. Regenerative medicine is a fairly new field that's coming up fast. Treatments for all manner of ailments currently in development, and there is now some hope that neurodegenerative diseases like ALS and Alzheimer's could be treated, along with spinal cord injuries and a variety of others. It's easy to see how AI will amplify this type of progress. I've always suffered with low vision. I had to wear glasses from a fairly young age, and I remember asking my eye doctor way back then whether he thought there would ever be a cure for blindness. And being a child, I didn't realize that there were several different types of blindness, so it was kind of a dumb question. And also that my elderly family eye doctor probably wasn't perched on the edge of all the latest research in any case. He scoffed, I remember, and shook his head dismissively. No way, he said. The problem is that the eye is just way too complicated. We'll never figure it out. For the first time, I can realistically imagine him eating those words. AI models are already assisting with this type of research in the area of retinal regeneration. It's easy to imagine that using the same type of modeling that was used with DeepMind's protein folding victory, you could train AI to more effectively and more quickly address degenerative eye diseases, holding out real hope that an overall cure for blindness could occur in our lifetime. And all this is good. I mean, I don't know that I want to live forever, but a couple hundred more years might hit the spot. I would like the option to eradicate this ailment or the other with a flip of a switch. I want my loved ones to have the same option. It'd be nice that when you hear from your oncologist that you have stage 4 cancer and know that rather than it being a death sentence, it simply means that your trip to the Star Trekky scanning device is going to cost a little more. This is why people say there's such an enormous potential upside to go along with all the catastrophic potential downside. At the ends of this AI spectrum, we have either immortality or the extinction of the species. And the trick, of course, is to get it all right, to navigate through all our worst human impulses and strive toward a future that, in the end, we all must surely want. One where we can live long, healthy lives, economically secure, surrounded by friends, family, and adventure. One where we can offload all our worries and cares to powerful robots who will do all the heavy lifting, leaving us to explore ourselves and each other and find some higher purpose in this wild world we find ourselves in. And who knows, maybe there is a path to this utopia, and we all just need to have a little faith. Let's give these massive tech companies and the governments of the world the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that good will prevail and all the AI doomer predictions will seem increasingly absurd as the years progress and we all settle into this new reality. Bear in mind, though, we don't have to assume that we need to achieve superintelligence to find reasons to be suitably depressed by the continual evolution of AI. The ubiquity of this technology ensures that it's unlikely that there will be a single domain of our lives that will fall outside its reach. Our jobs will be uprooted and replaced altogether. Whether you're a lawyer, a doctor, or work on an assembly line, someone somewhere even now is creating a more efficient, more productive, and more driven version of you and I in a research lab. Some of these vocations will hold out longer than others. It looks like a lot of the blue-collar jobs will be the ones that will be the most challenging to replace, given that the robotics flank of the AI revolution seems to be lagging behind a little. Turns out it's a lot easier for a machine to read through previous court judgments than it is to unclog a toilet. But robotics will catch up shortly. After viewing demos by some of the top companies in this field just the other day, the gains do appear rather impressive. I almost said unfortunately there, but I don't know. I'm torn about the whole thing. But I can't imagine the overlap will be too long in any case. With the way things are going, I wouldn't be surprised if virtually all human employment was either swapped out or heavily augmented by some version of AI within the next 5 to 10 years. And again, you'll hear the cry of progress, that this will transform employment in the same way that the Industrial Revolution did, but in this case, it will make all of our lives easier. It will improve our lives for the better, reduce any hours of actual work we'll need to do during a week, or perhaps eliminate it altogether, and give us time to do all the things that we really want to do. AI's effects can already be seen across a wide breadth of society today, and in many ways, this transformation is being welcomed with open arms. Self-driving cars will soon liberate us en masse from the soul-sucking tedium of morning rush hour. Used in concert with satellite-guided apps, streaming to-the-minute traffic updates will further optimize the driving experience, cutting down time, cutting out temporal waste. Search engines, media, and advertising will continue to hone in on our preferences and predilections, prompting us and baiting us with ever-increasing accuracy. We tend to resent this on principle, but yet seem incapable of resisting that juicy made-to-order news story that's sitting there on our screen just waiting for us to click. AI is already being used in healthcare, banking and financial services, cybersecurity. And as our jobs are replaced, and frankly, optimized in many ways, the way we interact and communicate with each other and the rest of the world will change. AI already influences the news we consume and how we consume it. It suggests potential matches for us on dating apps. It recommends books, films, music. You would think that surely some jobs would survive this vocational apocalypse. You'd at least expect there to be some human sign-off for a lot of things, but not necessarily. Your AI assistant, for example, will be able to diagnose you with most forms of cancer better than any human doctor. Why would you want a human there to potentially overrule the clear statistical favorite? You would probably have sounder decisions with policy. A dead boy on a beach isn't likely to move your AI governing algorithm to dramatically throw open the borders in the same way that an executive body governed by soft-hearted humans would. In the judicial sphere, the punishment would forever fit the crime, at least in theory. An uncompromising logic, incapable of bias, incapable of sympathy, and assiduously applying any extenuating circumstances into its decision should, at the very least, be consistent in its application of justice with the laws that we had set out. Also have some interesting game theory play out in international relations. AI wouldn't ever react emotionally in any cases of brinksmanship. In fact, two nations that had publicly declared their rules of engagement up front could lend more credibility to their retaliatory promises. So you have a country like Russia that wants to make a move on a relatively small neighboring NATO member. With our current setup, it's possible that an aggressive Russian leader could invade, relying on what he perceives to be a weak and unwilling American president to fully get behind any major counterattack. With AI at the helm, though, counterattack is guaranteed. It's right there in the code. The clarity would be even more pronounced with nukes. North Korea isn't going to launch a missile at Japan if they know with absolute certainty that their entire country would be annihilated within 20 minutes of that launch. This is likely the ultimate instantiation of Henry Ford's dream. Let everything be automated and liberate humanity from the toils of work and worry. At long last, we can kick up our feet and spend more time with our families, with our friends, traveling, and doing all the things that we really want to do. And here's where I'd like to pause and meditate on that for a minute. The ultimate promise here seems to be that AI in general is going to make all of our lives easier, less burdensome, and more fulfilling. It will assume all the tedious labor and open up our schedules so that we can finally do all the things that we want to do. I think this is crucial. I've always loved writing. When I was in kindergarten or grade 1 or 2, I can't recall which, I wrote a story 3 workbooks thick when the assignment was to write one in 500 words or something like that. I couldn't stop. I loved assembling the worlds and building the characters and weaving the various fictions around each other like commingling cobwebs. All through high school, I continued to write, sent off screenplays to Hollywood. They were summarily rejected, and wrote stories for myself and for others. I've written a novel and had arranged my life in such a way as to write my second novel last year. When ChatGPT came out at the end of 2022, I was mostly caught off guard. At first, I thought it seemed interesting, and I played around with it a little, asking questions as if I were probing some new life form, but being fairly unimpressed with the answers, most of which insisted that this thing was merely a machine and couldn't feel or want for anything. It wasn't until I heard someone had asked it to write a song in the style of Bob Dylan that I began to feel unsettled. The song itself was derivative, quite literally, and I didn't find it particularly interesting. But some new, profound vehicle of plagiarism had been given birth here, and I didn't like it. When I heard about the Drake song mashups, my alarm bells went off again. I started worrying about how this might affect the publishing industry and the perpetually struggling writer. Certainly, with this new level of hackery, many people will use tools like this to start pumping out mediocre swill that will clog up the bookshelves and make it less likely for any real diamonds in the rough to shine through. I found myself perseverating over this. It seemed like every day I was reading about some new way that someone had found to manipulate some generative AI program to do something. Whether it was a deep faked video of Joe Biden, or new AI art that was illustrating surreal landscapes, or the mashing together of songs in a flagrant wanton bukkake on copyright laws. The headlines in tech magazines or in promotional material for these nascent generative AI companies all seem to promise a brave new world for human art, a bold new frontier, the combination of man and machine, making something truly revolutionary. Want to start work on that great new American novel? Good news! Generative AI will help you get there. Just enter a few simple prompts on where you want the story to go, and you can dispense with all the drudgery of actually doing the writing and focus on telling the story you've always wanted to tell, but never had the time. Always wanted to make a song, but don't have the patience to learn an instrument? Good news! Gen AI will help you do that too. Just tell it what style of song you want to write, or whether you want it to be happy or sad, and Gen AI will fix you up in under a minute. Always wanted to be an artist, but never had any talent? Good news. Now you can just tell Gen AI what you want the picture to look like, and it will draw it for you. Start off with a basic idea, order the AI to make certain tweaks here and there by employing commands like less angry, or more beautiful, more unique, or hell, just better. Make it better. The narrative on this is that this is the democratization of art. Just as the internet and social media provided everyone with the ability to voice their opinions and be a part of the national conversation, this evolution will allow those who weren't blessed with certain talents the ability to create things that they never would have been able to before. But while there is a sheen of equivalence here, it is actually a fundamentally meretricious argument. These nouveau artists aren't actually creating anything. They're outsourcing their creativity. Simply saying that you want to write a story about a man who hitchhikes on a spaceship, travels around the galaxy, encounters all kinds of crazy, wacky characters, and finds out the meaning of life isn't actually writing a book. It's barely a high-level movie pitch. Writing is about how you tell the story, not what the story is about. It absolutely requires the writer's full-time commitment. It requires sacrifice. It's about the long hours wrestling with ideas until finally something jumps out at you. It's about the fucking writing. The literal assembly of sentences and paragraphs into a narrative, the story or structure, the phrasing and parsing of all those concatenations are everything. There's no shortcut you can take that will cut out all the hard stuff and leave you with the glory. Is this disingenuous to say that Gen AI is creating an equal playing field to everyone that somehow wasn't born with the requisite talent? First of all, talent and passion are often complementary. Generally, someone who has a talent for something also tends to be rather passionate about it, and anyone passionate about something will often eventually acquire the talent. This is simply a marketing strategy that uses equality as their selling point, knowing they can shill their lazy coattail riding wares so long as they're flying that banner. I started to wonder why this bothered me so much, and it wasn't because I thought the LLMs could write better than me. I don't think that, and I don't think they ever could. In fact, I don't think they could ever write better than any reasonably creative writer. But there was something beyond just their flooding of the field with all this spam-like noise that was getting under my skin here. Although to be sure, that is a major problem to consider. When machines are pumping out works at 100 times the speed, eventually it becomes so much of it that even those who have talent can't stand out anymore. By lowering the bar, it has us all roiling about in the muck. 100 monkeys typing away for 100 years might not be able to churn out Shakespeare, but what about 1,000 monkeys? 1,000,000? 1,000,000,000? There's that speed factor again. And you might say that the work would still require gatekeepers to determine which books are worth reading and which aren't, and that would be the thing that would separate the wheat from the chaff. But with all this new AI content to sift through, this becomes a rather challenging endeavor. But don't worry, folks, we have a solution for that too. AI will now trawl through all that riffraff to isolate the works that are most likely to resonate with you on a human level. I mean, I can't help but think that this will invariably introduce a massive creative stagnation in humans as we rely more on these technologies to both produce our art or assist us in producing art. Someone like myself, who, first of all, has principles when it comes to things like this, but who also writes more for pleasure than any kind of mass consumption, won't be as affected. There's never a situation where I would use AI to assist me in writing something. I even avoid spell checkers when I can. But those who are competing for some sort of financial reward may find themselves relying on these tools more and more as they attempt to bump up their quantity to offset the loss in overall quality. It would be a race to the bottom, so to speak, and many creative artists will find themselves reluctant to resist this type of temptation if they're still relying on book sales or record sales or art sales to pay the rent. If that one quality painting that takes you a month to create and sells for $5,000 is no longer selling due to an egregious surplus of product in the field, then maybe 5,000 paintings created mostly by AI tools will sell for $1 a piece and you're net even at the end of the day. Of course, I would argue that any artist, painter, writer, musician, whatever, who's willing to use AI to help it create things isn't an artist at all. But that's somewhat beside the point. There's always been hacks who view these mediums as more of a way to grind out a living than actually producing something that's meaningful to them or their audience. With AI, though, this will reach a whole new level, just given the speed that these plagiaristic blasphemies can be churned out. However, we do have to consider how this stuff is being produced. I mean, there is zero creativity happening here. All an AI can do is take inputs from previous works and try to rearrange things to make something that can be viewed as new or different. Keep in mind what it's using as its corpus of data on which to construct these works. It's all just based on things that humans have done in the past. So then, I can't help but wonder what happens when AI starts producing creative works that has as its input previous AI works. It would then be feeding off the carcasses of its ancestors and using artificial input as data to then produce new creative output. I mean, what sort of Frankenstein abominations will be spawned forth when AI is subsisting off a diet of AI for its source material. And in the same way the spaceship can be set off course with just the smallest miscalculation in its initial trajectory, it's fairly easy to see how a few small misconnections in the source material can lead to hefty hallucinations in subsequent editions. Look at it this way. If AI produced songs start making up the vast majority of music that we're exposed to, and AI gatekeepers are required to filter out what it considers unworthy, since there's way too much music out there for humans to be able to go through it all, then we're continually at the mercy of what the AI's heuristics considers to be good music. Even if humans have some token spot on the chain here, we only know what we're exposed to. After a few generations of AI regurgitating its own waste and spewing it out into our Spotify playlist, while we still may have agency enough to say that song A is better than song B, the AI won't know why song A is better than song B, and it could very well tweak its next work in some way that it doesn't actually improve the song to our ears, but it still gives us the option of two less impressive works that we can then decide on. We're out of the equation at that point. The decisions are being made for us. You could say that we've already been exposed to this methodology over the years since we've always had kind of gatekeepers or experts in the field, film critics or music executives and such, that have been telling us sort of what's good and what isn't. But at least in this case, like the gatekeepers are still human and individual gatekeepers are still making subjective human decisions on what is considered good and what is considered bad. Like there's only so far off course that can get. Like there's always going to be more similarities in the taste between two different humans than there is any one human and an AI. There's always going to be trash, too. There's always going to be that basic recipe that appeals to the masses, like the salt, sugar, fat trifecta that was perfected by junk food companies years ago. But with AI, we'll be drowning in a much larger sea of manufactured mediocrity. The brute forcing of palatability could flood the market to such an extent that those of us who do have a refined palate for this sort of stuff will have nowhere left to look for our favorite dishes. I think it's really hard for us to understand that what we're dealing with here is a completely different type of intelligence. We just can't conceptualize something like that. I mean, we know as humans, at least implicitly, that what ultimately resonates with people isn't necessarily those parts of a song that can be cut up or spliced and replicated. It isn't necessarily the rhythm or the chorus or the beat. It's more holistic than that, at least for really good music. Like, art is greater than the sum of its parts. It's the extra second or so of doleful attenuation on a Miles Davis song, hanging on to that note longer than you would imagine you would, as if for dear life, as if raging against the dying of the light. The mounting desperation through the verses of The Cure's Disintegration, how Robert Smith's plaintive wails instantiate the agony he's feeling while his world crumbles apart around him. Or the sadomasochistic sexual frenzy in Life is a Grotesque Animal by the band Of Montreal, where the instrumentation quivers in a way that instinctively makes us anxious, on edge, ready for action. Are these the kinds of results that would ever naturally emerge through a purely AI work? I don't know. I'm not sure you can actually quantify art. It's somewhat analogous to the soul here in the sense that I don't believe it's something that could ever be replicated. You can imagine that even if you increase the number of parameters taken into consideration when training an AI, increase the power of compute, that there's still a physical upper limit somewhere that we can never truly surpass, and that will be the thing that keeps AI from ever being able to replicate human art. Maybe that's built into the system. I'm someone who believes in God and a whole other world beyond that which we can presently perceive, so I'm slightly biased in this case, but maybe that's the upper limit, after which there's not enough compute power on Earth that would ever allow an AI to calculate all those variables. Crime and Punishment, written by Dostoevsky, is a towering achievement. Crime and Punishment, written by a trillion monkeys, is a statistical inevitability at some point. But perhaps that point can never be reached simply due to the emotional and philosophical complexity of the work. There's too many variables. Too much power would be required to slip them all into the equation. It's like an uncertainty principle governing AI growth. Beyond here, we cannot pass. We cannot know. I mean, I'm mostly just speculating now, of course. There's some interesting cosmic parallel here, I think, between the observable limitations in probing the unfathomably small and the resource limitations when wanting to go big. Honestly, I can't imagine anything AI produced in the area of art to be worth much of anything. But again, I'm biased. And I'm conscious of the fact that I've been naive to this type of thing in the past. Your mileage may vary. I know people might ask whether it should even matter whether something was created by a human or by a machine if you're talking about the same piece of art. I guess my contention is that that equivalence isn't there, and I don't believe it ever will be. When people start asking AI to write a song in the style of AI System 33479, then I'll take another look. Anyway, let's get back to this idea of how we're creating a world where we offload all of our tasks to machines so we can live our lives doing all those things we've always wanted to do. There's several companies that are now developing personal AI assistants. Some fledgling versions of them are already developed and are starting to roll out. Currently, their list of talents are fairly limited, but the vision and roadmap is laid out for so much more. So these assistants are essentially robots, but built with service in mind. Right now, they can fetch you a coffee, tell you what the weather is outside, presumably vacuum your carpet, and just generally keep you company like a creepy humanoid manifestation of Alexa skulking around your living room. But these robots are improving, and fast. They'll soon be marketed as our new best friends, replacing dogs who will then be jettisoned back into the wild after enjoying their cushy, centuries long position at our side. Like, why would you want a dog anymore? This pissing on the rug, inconvenient illnesses, dumbass decisions, when you can have one of these new creations, some of which are already literally designed to look like dogs. With your new assistant, you'll get much more than just a companion. Soon they'll be able to simulate all the best that a dog has to offer, but without any of the downsides. You can even upload your dog's consciousness to the cloud and then sidestep all the heartache you would normally have to endure when it dies, and then just pop it back into new hardware once the cool new versions are released. Beyond just having someone to hang with, future AGI assistants will understand what you want in some cases better than you do. In fact, one of the goals for at least one of these companies is for everyone to have a personal robot assistant, catering to our whims and subject to our commands, optimizing our lifestyle, making all those tedious choices for us and counseling us on the larger ones, potentially saving us hours every day that we would otherwise have spent toiling over some pesky decision we had to make in the course of living our lives. I envision the dynamic with these assistants as very much akin to that of a Kaiser and a Chancellor. Like think Otto von Bismarck, or take the Game of Thrones angle, a king in his hand. The hand would be doing all the work, calculating the odds in any given situation and providing us with critical information we wouldn't otherwise know, running the country, as it were. And we could just muck about like Robert Baratheon, like whoring and drinking and hunting wild animals. Or maybe your ambitions aren't so lofty, and you merely want an advisor for certain scenarios, some best friend which can calculate all the odds for you in any given situation and offer you the best advice. It will literally be the best advice that's quantitatively available, by the way. Like it'll tell you what to wear, what time you should leave to go to the restaurant, answer any question you might have at the drop of a hat, play chess with you after dropping down several levels. But it would tweak its displayed ability to any game to roughly match yours so as to optimize the experience for you. As more humans are replaced and stowed away in their one bedroom hovels to subsist off the magnanimity of government and whatever basic income solution is eventually adopted, our general lives will become much, much easier. None of us would presumably have jobs at this point, so the decisions would all be focused around optimizing our living experience. Make sure you bring Otto along to chaperone your first date. He'll pick up on all the body language you miss, assessing psychological tells, measuring the hue of flushed skin after you said something particularly witty, analyzing the width of smiles, the rapidity of batted lashes, the number of times your date plays with her hair, casting all this against some relative benchmark and spitting out a matchability ranking for you to pore over later. Of course, this would all be customizable. You'd be able to tweak such things as kindness, cleverness, humor, so you could tone down the verbosity if you still wanted to retain some sense of mystery or romanticism to the whole thing. For the rejection wary, you could probably tweak Otto to let you down gently. Maybe initially he'd say that the girl you met seemed to like you a great deal based on all the nonverbal cues he said he was picking up, but then only subtly over the next few weeks he'd try to steer you away from her just to spare your feelings. I can't help but chuckle when I imagine the mounting absurdity of such situations as the intelligence of these machines substantially increases. I envision this man and his new human beau meeting for lunch one day while their deity like assistants amuse themselves off to the side. Otto and Odette simultaneously playing 1,000 Grandmaster level chess games against each other, collectively probing the mysteries of the universe and perhaps even solving the Riemann hypothesis, while their two autocrat simpletons giggle like imbeciles because one spilled spaghetti sauce on their shirt. It just all doesn't seem very likely to end up the way we hope it might. I wonder how many of us are just likely to abandon the idea of relationships altogether. It might seem superfluous to those raised on safe spaces and virtual gaming. Why bother with all the stress of finding a potential mate, having to make lifestyle compromises, having to deal with various moods and temperaments of your partner, all the other things that make living with someone so challenging? Why not just eliminate that custom altogether? I mean, one can only imagine the dizzying heights that pornography will reach in this bold new bespoke world that we're entering. We're soon likely to have very believable sex robots that can be programmed to assist us with whatever fucked up fantasy happens to be tickling at our brain on any given day. There will probably even be an option to switch on the post-coital cuddling request if you really want to aim for authenticity. Of course, as the nuclear family breaks down, as the number of children running around dwindles, as we are all pulled away from our real lives by the cornucopia of distractions that will pelt us day and night, what measure of tedium would it be to even have a conversation with another person at all? Talking to people who don't see the world exactly as you see it? What is even the incentive to just hang out with friends or meet up with family members? The world will be at your fingertips. The virtual world, anyway. If you ever find yourself wanting of love or even just companionship, you've got Otto. Okay, maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Not that this isn't precisely the trajectory that we're on in society at the moment, but I'm getting dangerously close to ranting right now, so I'll peel it back. I mean, you see the outrage, right? It's like the single purpose automation I get. Fold those proteins, crank out those widgets, advance medical science to a point where we can at least solve some of the problems that we face today. I can even get on board with this idea that this thing is going to replace virtually all of our jobs, regardless of the fact that that's going to take a tremendous, tremendous toll on our mental health, how our economy is structured, and affect us negatively in a whole host of other domains that we haven't even considered yet. But when we start inserting AI into the most personal and the most human aspects of our lives, I can't help but wonder what we're hoping to achieve here. What's the end game exactly? That we hook ourselves up to a perpetual pleasure machine and just sit there cavitating and drooling while the machines do all the work of living for us? I keep coming back to this phrase again and again. The machines will free us from having to work and will let us do all the things that we don't have time to do right now. And what is that exactly? If we have machines that are acting as surrogate lovers for us, standing in as our best friends, making all the difficult decisions, creating our music, probing the mysteries of the universe, at that point, where do we even fit in? How are we even growing or learning or even living? And why do we all seem to be okay with writing ourselves out of the story? One of the things we've done on Intimate Discourse is focus certain episodes on qualities that make humans human. They aren't necessarily good or bad things. Most times they can be a bit of both. But they are all immutably human characteristics. And while we don't have to necessarily be proud of them or ashamed of them, we do have to recognize that they are the things that make us, us, and not something else. They're all an integral part of the human experience. And when we decide that it's a good idea to start chipping away at the bone, it's only a matter of time before the whole structure collapses. It takes a certain amount of effort to thrust oneself forward in a venture. Learning a new language, for example, takes years to truly master. There's a certain pride in that, and pride should be felt, especially if that language isn't indigenous to your locale. You're investing your time and energy into something and rewarded for it with the ability to communicate in a whole new sphere. And shifting that dynamic with Google Translate or whatever other Babelfish type of instrument we're going to have in the future here may be convenient for those who don't speak a language, but it devalues what the person accomplished who did learn the language. There's a certain growth that happens in people when they learn a new language or learn how to play the piano or speak publicly or even learn how to read and write from the ground up. There's a development there and then a pride that blooms from realizing that you've mastered it. I know people who have spent their whole careers meticulously learning various programming languages so that they can become the best in their fields. Someone only needs to ask ChatGPT to write a blackjack program and voila, done in a few seconds. What will this eventually do to people? Without exercising these muscles, won't they atrophy? So I'm a runner. I go out fairly regularly, or at least I did until I broke my leg, which I'm still getting over. But I remember once when preparing to go out for a midwinter run in fairly miserable conditions, a friend of mine who was my roommate at the time asked me why I do it. I gave him some of the usual arguments. It's healthy, keeps me from getting too overweight, gets the blood going, whatever. He then asked if I would still go running if there was an option available to just take a pill that would keep me thin, keep the blood pressure down, and just generally provide all the health benefits that I currently get from running. I thought about this for a moment, but eventually replied that I'd probably still go. I tried to articulate how it made me feel afterwards, the sense of accomplishment, the sublime exhaustion, how it tended to flush out all the crazies and leave my mind in a blissful state of relative calm, and that a pill wouldn't ever really be able to do that. So then he asked, well, what if there was such a pill? And it would give you all the health benefits and make you feel just as relaxed, and you'd still feel whatever chemical reactions that would be associated with accomplishment. Would you then take it instead of running? And I was like, well, that's the whole thing, though. I mean, it was sort of a stillbirth of a question. It's like saying, if you could take a pill that would make you feel happy all the time, but you'd also experience the sensation of being fulfilled in your life, but in reality, you were just sitting on the couch, would you take it? You might as well ask, if you could take a pill that would do all the living for you, would you take it? At some point, those questions just reduce down to ontological absurdities. Dimitri said something on one of our episodes that really stuck with me. If you were a soul that hadn't been born yet, how would you want to live your life? What would be your reason for wanting to be born? Would it be that you would want to go through all the tribulations and trauma of birth only to sit around on a couch all day or lay in the sun for years on end? No, you'd want to live, experience. You'd want to challenge yourself and overcome and create and love. Why would we ever want to outsource any of that? I've heard it said that eventually we'll all be consuming only our own content, or rather, content that we dictate to an AI. So instead of watching a movie or reading a book, we'll tell the AI what kind of virtual world we'd like to immerse ourselves in, snap our fingers, and our wish would be its command. We could customize the world in real time, introduce challenges we know we can overcome, and characters we know we like, women or men that would incarnate all the characteristics that we know that we want in our beloved. This type of customized fantasy world sounds like it would be heaven on earth, absolutely incredible for about one day. We're social creatures, and we can't live or grow in isolation. We need others with whom to frolic. We need their experiences, their stories, their ideas of what's beautiful and what's not. Those positive feedback loops are a killer. Just look at all the Avengers movies. In the same way that news on social media reinforces one's pre-existing biases, consuming artificially created content that uses your own pre-existing preferences as a template on which to build isn't likely to expose you to anything new in the way of ideas. I remember when I first started listening to The Cure or The Smiths in high school. I revered those bands. I felt what they were communicating to me on a pure visceral level. This identification that comes with musicians or artists or writers is, I think, a healthy thing. In our day-to-day lives, we're not often encountering the kinds of life and death struggles that writers will often write about or paint about even. Usually we're just living through some minor version of that drama. But our imaginations are large, and our dreams can be massive. And it's in that space that we find solace and inspiration in this type of art. When I read Kafka, I'm not just passively consuming a bewildering account of Kay's frustrations with the legal system. I'm wrapped up and fused with the mind of Kafka. I'm relating to the helplessness one feels against the harsh monolith of bureaucracy. I'm connecting with the anxiety that bleeds through the pages. I'm on a journey with Kafka, and I'm all in because I feel all those things too. There's a connection there between writer and reader that transcends the story itself, and is more than the sum of its parts. I read Confederacy of Dunces quite some time ago, but I still distinctly remember cackling insanely on a subway in Toronto while reading a certain passage that I was undoubtedly referencing in some way the almost indescribable pomposity of Ignatius Riley, the main character. And there's a character that is just so uniquely human, pompous and yet so singularly vulnerable. We need to, I think, appreciate and cherish what we have in humanity. We've gotten so hopped up on technology that we've collectively forgotten the truly important things in life: art, love, desire, beauty, discovery, self-growth, other people. Microsoft had an ad for a while which I think perfectly symbolizes the different directions our world could go at this nexus. And, I think that big tech companies kind of want to send us in one direction, and, there's some part of us that really wants to go in the other direction. But I think this ad kind of summed it up perfectly. There's a man is asking Bing to write a graduation card for his son, who's presumably graduating, and I just, you know, the fact that I mean, the way I see it anyway is like that should be self-evident why that is such an abomination. Uh, I mean, it's just everything that's wrong with the world right there. Um, like your child is graduating. It's the time, one of the few times really, like in a year that you would maybe really want to say something from the heart and like use your own words to express it and really take the time to search to so you're saying the right thing that is meaningful to you and meaningful to your son. And the fact that Microsoft just doesn't get it, where it's like I don't know, it just seems really disconnected to me. Um, anyway, artificial intelligence can never understand us on this level, and we need to be sure that we don't make the mistake of believing that it can. And we also need to be sure that AI and technology in general continues to serve us rather than the other way around. Ilya Sutskever, the lead scientist at OpenAI, recently claimed that he believes that next token prediction is enough to eventually usher in AGI. His contention is that AI will soon be able to extrapolate on source material that isn't even there, making connections that we haven't otherwise provided in some way or another. Again, I think we get into a semantics game with the word extrapolate. Well, I'm sure Ilya is a brilliant man in his field. I can't help but sense the same hubris that also been a uniquely human trait throughout the centuries. There is no ghost inside the machine here, folks. It's just a potentially dangerous tool that could run amok and control our lives if we let it. But, even if we could create this kind of life, even if we could make an AI so that it could do everything that a human could do, but even better, but without all the doomsday scenarios, why would we even want it? Like, I don't want to hear that in GPT-9 they will have created some metahuman AI that will then know down to a science specifically why it was that I was cackling like a maniac on that subway that day. It had dissected Tool's exact word choice in the passage that cracked me up and matched it to previous experiences I'd had and my precise psychological disposition, and could then replicate such sentences as some new book that it could write almost instantly and ship to me same day for 1995. I don't want it to delineate and quantify down to the ones and zeros exactly why Philip is so obsessed with Mildred and of human bondage, despite his hating her and her being an obvious cancer that he should avoid at all costs. Why on earth would I ever want to know that? Like, why must we strive so militantly to unveil every fucking mystery? Can't we just wonder anymore? There's a song by Nina Simone called Isn't It a Pity? I mean, I love a lot of her stuff, but this song in particular strikes me as somehow encapsulating something uniquely unquantifiable in terms of trying to replicate what's so good about it. It's a languorous lament, over 10 minutes long, I think, and not a whole lot happens in it. Like, the somber music is punctuated now and then by Nina mentioning how it's such a pity that we take each other for granted. There isn't any catchy beat or memorable chorus or even any truly interesting lyrics that make it such a great song. It's just all about how she's expressing what she's feeling through her voice, through the timbre of her word choice. These uncertain pauses somehow manage to sneak in. The way she wistfully says, everything is plastic at the end with that flick of a tongue. This is an elegy to humanity as a whole that's particularly fitting at this crossroads we find ourselves at. The song is it's fundamentally depressing, it's hopeless, and it's fraught with sadness. And yet at the same time, it's absolutely beautiful. And let's not forget who we are or where we've come from. And let's not write ourselves out of the equation. That would truly be a pity. Thank you for listening to me today. I really hope you got something out of this, and I encourage you and would be thankful if you could share this podcast or like or subscribe. It means a lot. And thank you again.